Like the fans said, hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go. Caitlin Clark fans clearly no showing the Indiana Fever versus the Las Vegas Aces. It was smack dab empty. It will cost you more to get a small fry with no burger and no drink than it would have cost to sit in the 100 section in the lower bowl. This is
Picture this. You are standing outside a professional sports arena on game night. The parking lot is half empty. The lines at the concession stands move faster than they should. The ushers look bored. Inside, entire sections of lower bowl seats sit vacant, row after row of untouched cushions stretching across a building that was selling out weeks ago. Secondary market tickets are trading for less than a fast food combo meal, not a cheap combo meal either. We are talking about sitting in the lower bowl for $28, $33, $37 in sections that were previously commanding $300 and $400 from fans who were practically begging to get in. And the reason for all of it is two words: back issues. That is the entire explanation the Indiana Fever organization offered when they announced that Caitlin Clark would not be suiting up. Two vague, clinical, carefully chosen words that explained absolutely nothing, answered absolutely nothing, and reassured absolutely no one. Two words dropped into a fan base that had been watching their player absorb an unusual and frankly alarming amount of physical punishment all season long without adequate protection from the officiating crew or, critically, from the sideline. The fans responded the only way that genuinely powerful consumers can respond when an institution fails them. They simply did not go. Not a few of them.
The Indiana Fever are playing tonight's game. No Caitlin Clark. We have Stephanie White's lackluster offense. We have Stephanie White's lackluster defense. And fans just simply aren't excited for it. Especially after the runaround we went through last year, not watching Caitlin Clark for 75% of the season. Many fans don't want to go through the same song and dance again. We went through it last year. We don't want to go through it this year. Furthermore, with how this team, how this organization, how this coach doesn't protect their star player, it ain't good. Stephanie White waits for Caitlin Clark to get injured to finally stick up to the refs, to finally call out the officiating. Too little, too late. Then Stephanie White goes out, gives us
not a quiet drift, a visible, dramatic, photogenic exodus that turned those arenas into monuments to mismanaged potential. Social media lit up immediately. Comment sections flooded with variations of the same message, delivered with remarkable clarity and unanimity. No Caitlin Clark, no ticket. No Caitlin Clark, no viewership. No Caitlin Clark, no interest. Period. Full stop. End of conversation. And here is what makes this moment genuinely historic and genuinely alarming for everyone with a stake in the future of professional basketball. This was not apathy. Apathy is quiet. Apathy does not organize itself into comment sections and Twitter threads and YouTube videos and podcast conversations. What happened in those arenas was deliberate, coordinated, and pointed directly at the people making decisions inside that franchise. It was a referendum delivered through empty seats, and the verdict was not ambiguous. What you are witnessing right now is not a rough patch. It is not a scheduling issue. It is not a bad week that will be forgotten by next month. What you are watching in real time with the volume turned all the way up is the structural unraveling of a league that had one chance. One genuine, generational, once-in-a-lifetime chance to change the entire conversation around women's professional basketball. And instead of protecting that chance with everything they had, instead of building the infrastructure and the culture and the advocacy that the moment demanded, they let it walk to the injury report while executives scrambled to contain the damage behind closed doors. The arenas are hollow. The tickets are nearly free. The fans are gone. And the most important player this sport has ever produced is sitting out while the people who were supposed to protect her figure out how to explain what went wrong. This is that story, all of it. No surface-level takes. No press release language, just the real breakdown of what happened, why it happened.
No-showed. They no-showed. Look at this. All these empty seats. Just seats everywhere. Seats everywhere. All these joints. I mean, come on, man. The fans have officially spoke. They're not going if CC ain't out there. Like, it is what it is. Y'all know, Caitlin Clark, Indiana Fever fans travel on the road. Now, there was still fans there that got some autographs from Caitlyn and all of that. She's always going to have some fans show up. Sophie and them, Raven, they always signing autographs and stuff. But for the most part, it was a no-show. It was a no-show, man. The fans spoke. They're not rocking with this. They're not rocking with what the Indiana Fever are doing. Now, we also had Chinny Ogwumike and Andrea Carter completely. It's almost like Caitlyn don't exist on this team. You can bank it after this. This is going to be
who is responsible and what it means for the future of a league that may have just squandered the greatest gift it was ever given. To understand how catastrophically the Indiana Fever organization and the WNBA have mismanaged this moment, you first have to appreciate what they were actually handed when Caitlin Clark declared for the draft. Because this was not a normal draft pick situation. This was not a talented college player transitioning into a professional environment with reasonable expectations and a standard developmental timeline. This was a cultural earthquake. A seismic event in the landscape of women's sports that had been building for 4 years of college basketball and arrived in Indianapolis with the force of something that happens maybe once in a generation across any sport, men's or women's, professional or amateur. Clark came out of Iowa having shattered virtually every meaningful scoring record in the history of college basketball. Not women's basketball, all of college basketball. She had become appointment television at a scale that the sport had never experienced. Her games were drawing ratings that embarrassed established programs and established players. She had crossed over from sports fan favorite to genuine mainstream cultural figure in a way that only a handful of athletes in any generation ever managed to pull off. And she had brought an entire audience with her. This is the part that deserves the most emphasis, because it is the part that gets glossed over when people discuss the commercial implications of her professional career. Caitlin Clark did not simply arrive in the WNBA as a skilled player who the league could market to its existing fan base. She arrived as a proven, documented audience generator who brought a completely new demographic of fan into contact with professional women's basketball for the very first time. People who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives were suddenly buying tickets, purchasing merchandise, subscribing to streaming services, and traveling across state lines to watch the Indiana Fever play road games in arenas where the home franchise had never seen anything like the turnout Clark's presence produced. The league signed television deals calibrated around this new reality. Sponsors allocated budgets they had never previously committed to women's basketball. Streaming platforms promoted games with the kind of marketing muscle they reserve for properties with genuine mainstream crossover appeal. Local businesses near arena sites started planning around game nights in ways that had not been economically justified before Clark arrived. The financial infrastructure of the WNBA's future was being quietly rebuilt around a single assumption. Caitlin Clark would be on the court, healthy, playing at a high level, and drawing the audience she had always drawn. That assumption was not unreasonable, it was logical. It was supported by every data point available. What was unreasonable, what turned out to be the catastrophic miscalculation at the center of everything that has unfolded since, was the assumption that the player generating all—
Since CC is out. My status, out till CC returns. Caitlyn is out, think I'll check out an evening movie. Damn. She needs to immediately walk away. I wouldn't want to play in this league either. Why watch then? Give us a reason. Wow, if CC is out, so am I. Wow. Then you have them posting this road trip starts now. You got Caitlin Clark's replacement on the flyer. Her replacement on the flyer, not Kelsey, not Sophie, not Aaliyah.
All of this value would be adequately protected by the institution benefiting from it. She was not. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable, and it needs to be told straight because too many people in the mainstream sports media have been dancing around it for months. From the moment Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, she absorbed a level of physical contact that serious observers noticed immediately. Not the normal physicality of professional basketball. Something different, something targeted, contact that was harder than it needed to be, plays that crossed the line between competitive basketball and deliberate physical intimidation. fouls that were not called with a consistency that defied the statistical odds of random variation. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, trackable pattern that analysts, statisticians, and longtime league observers have been discussing openly. Clark was being fouled at rates that did not match her foul calls received. She was being hit on plays where the whistle would have blown for other players. She was walking through an environment where the normal protective mechanisms of officiating were functioning inconsistently at best and not at all at worst. The question of why that pattern existed is complicated and deserves its own extended conversation. What matters for this story is not the motivation behind the pattern but the response to it. Because the response, or more precisely the lack of adequate response, is where the institutional failure becomes undeniable. Coaches protect their players. That is one of the most fundamental responsibilities of the person standing on the sideline, not just through tactical adjustments, not just through substitutions and lineup choices, through advocacy, through being loud, consistently, repeatedly, and on record about how their player is being treated. Through creating a culture around that player that signals to officials, to opposing coaches, and to opposing players that contact beyond the normal bounds of the game will not be tolerated and will not go unanswered. Stephanie White was not that coach, not visibly, not consistently, not in the moments when it mattered most. The delays were noticed. The restraint was noticed. The conspicuous absence of the kind of sideline advocacy that most successful coaches deploy instinctively when their star player is being targeted was noticed by every fan watching every game. And each time it happened, each time Clark took a hit that did not get called and the sideline response was muted or delayed or absent entirely, it deposited another small withdrawal from an account of trust that had a finite balance to begin with. Then came the injury. Back issues? 2 words. No timeline, no severity assessment, no imaging details, no clear path to return. Just 2 words dropped into the void and a fan base left to interpret them however their experience of watching this organization operate had prepared them to interpret institutional communication. And their experience had prepared them to be skeptical. So when the vague statement landed, the response was not patience and understanding. It was suspicion, frustration, and an immediate reaching for the pattern that had been building for months. The fans did not read the injury report as a routine update. They read it as the latest chapter in a story about an organization that had consistently chosen other priorities over the transparent protection of their players' health and career. And then they did not buy tickets. There is something that sports executives should understand about empty seats that they sometimes forget in the comfortable distance of their offices and their spreadsheets and their projected revenue models. Empty seats do not lie. They do not have an agenda. They cannot be spun by a public relations team. They cannot be reframed through strategic communication or brand repositioning or any of the other tools that organizations reach for when they need to manage a difficult narrative. An empty seat is the most honest data point in sports. It reflects a decision that an individual human being made, usually with their own money and their own time at stake, to take their attention and their dollars elsewhere. When thousands of people make that decision simultaneously, independently, and in response to the same set of circumstances, it is not a random fluctuation or a statistical anomaly. It is a verdict. The Indiana Fever Arenas delivered that verdict loudly and visibly the moment the word spread that Caitlin Clark would not be playing. Secondary market prices collapsed in real time. Sections that had been commanding hundreds of dollars per seat were suddenly available for $28, $33, $37. Lower bowl seats. The kinds of prices that signal not just reduced demand but near total demand collapse. The kind of pricing you see when a product loses its value so completely and so suddenly that the market simply cannot find a clearing price that justifies showing up. And the fans who stayed home were not quiet about it. The social media activity that accompanied the empty arenas was extraordinary in its volume, its coherence, and its specificity. These were not generic expressions of disappointment. They were detailed, articulate, and pointed directly at the specific failures that had eroded trust over the course of the season. People were naming the coaching decisions they disagreed with. They were referencing specific games where the officiating had failed. They were connecting the promotional flyer controversy to the injury opacity, to the delayed advocacy statements, to the broadcasting segment about the Kelsey Mitchell and Aaliyah Boston nickname partnership that ran while Clark was posting historic numbers, and somehow generated more media attention than her 20 points and 8 assists per game. My status out till CC returns. If CC is out, so am I. I wouldn't want to play in this league either. Stephanie White and the Fever organization doesn't have her back. I'm out, won't be watching. These are not the comments of passive consumers who wandered away out of boredom. These are the comments of invested, engaged, emotionally connected fans who made a deliberate decision to exercise the only form of leverage they actually have: their attention and their money. And the leverage worked, not in the sense that it immediately produced the outcomes they were demanding, but in the sense that it produced a financial reality so stark and so visible that the people responsible for the decisions that led to those empty seats could not ignore it. Let us talk about money, because the financial story unfolding here is not just alarming for the Indiana Fever specifically, it is alarming for the entire WNBA as an enterprise. The league's recent growth was not the result of a broadly rising tide that lifted all boats equally. It was concentrated. Specifically, tightly, almost entirely, it was concentrated around one player and the unprecedented audience she brought with her. Every television deal, every expanded sponsorship arrangement, every streaming agreement, every merchandise revenue projection was calibrated around the assumption that Caitlin Clark would be available, healthy, and performing at the level that made her the most compelling story in women's professional sports. The moment she steps off the court, the calibration breaks down completely. Streaming numbers reportedly dropped by significant margins in games she did not play, not slightly, significantly, in a way that mirrors the pattern documented during her college career, where Iowa games with Clark drew ratings that dwarfed Iowa games without her and dwarfed virtually every other women's basketball broadcast in the sport's history. The same relationship that existed in college transferred directly to the professional level, and the people writing checks for broadcast rights knew it and priced accordingly. Merchandise revenue tied to her name paused. Road game attendance, where Fever fans travel in numbers that have consistently embarrassed home franchises across the league, dried up. Concession revenue at arena sites dropped. Local business activity around game locations declined. The downstream ripple of a single player's absence from a single game spread outward through a financial ecosystem that had been quietly rebuilt around the assumption of her presence. This is what the league office reportedly understands and is reportedly losing sleep over. The financial model that the WNBA has been operating under, the one that justified the expanded television deals and the increased sponsor commitments and the broader infrastructure investments, was built on a single variable that the organization entrusted to an Indiana Fever franchise and a coaching staff that may not have fully understood what they were holding. Adam Silver and the league office cannot manufacture another Caitlin Clark. That conversation needs to happen plainly and directly, because sometimes the sports media talks around it in ways that obscure how serious it actually is. There is no developmental pipeline that produces another player with her specific combination of skill, charisma, basketball intelligence, and crossover cultural appeal on any predictable timeline. There is no marketing campaign that shortcuts the years of compelling, high-stakes performance that created the audience she brought with her. There is no strategic initiative that replaces what is lost when the one irreplaceable element of your financial model is sitting in a training room somewhere while 2 words on an injury report do all the explaining. The panic circulating in league offices is the natural response of people watching a financial model collapse in real time. And the decisions they make in the coming weeks, the pressure they choose to apply or not apply, the structural changes they choose to implement or not implement, will determine whether this moment is a correctable course deviation or the beginning of a longer and more painful unraveling. Stephanie White inherited what should have been the most enviable coaching situation in the history of the WNBA. A franchise with momentum, a front office with resources, a fan base that was growing at a rate no one had predicted, and a player who had already proven in college that she could carry an entire program on her back and make it must-see television every single night. The expectation, widely shared, logically grounded, and commercially validated, was that the organizational philosophy would orient entirely around maximizing Caitlin Clark's impact, building a system that amplified her strengths as a playmaker, a scorer, and a court vision player. Creating a cultural environment inside the program that communicated clearly to everyone, teammates, opponents, officials, and the media, that this franchise was built around this player and that any attempt to disrupt that foundation would be met with swift, vocal, and sustained resistance. That is not quite what materialized. The offensive system, by most independent assessments, has been inconsistent and difficult to read. Critics have pointed to possessions that seem to work against Clark's strengths rather than with them, shot distributions that do not reflect the statistical reality of who the team's most efficient scorer actually is. and a broader game planning philosophy that sometimes appears to be constructing around a version of the team that does not fully include Clark as the irreplaceable centerpiece. The defensive schemes have placed Clark in situations that more experienced coaches tend to protect their star players from, physically demanding defensive assignments that accumulate wear over the course of a long season in ways that intelligent roster construction is supposed to mitigate. And then there is the officiating response. When Clark was being targeted with unusual physicality, when the pattern became documented and visible and impossible for a coaching staff paying attention to ignore, the response from the sideline was consistently delayed, muted, or absent. The proactive advocacy that coaches who genuinely understand their responsibility to a star player deploy instinctively, in the moment loudly on record, was not the consistent feature of Clark's fever experience that the situation demanded. When White eventually did speak publicly about the officiating problem, the statement arrived late. The damage had already been done. The words were largely appropriate, but the timing destroyed whatever goodwill they might have generated. It registered as reactive rather than proactive, as damage control rather than genuine advocacy. And a fan base that had been watching the pattern develop over months received it as confirmation of what they had already concluded rather than as a reassurance that challenged their concerns. Coaches who fight for their players in the moment, loudly, consistently, and on record from the very beginning, create protective norms. Opposing teams understand that targeting the star will generate an immediate and sustained response from the bench and from the league office. Protecting your player is not just ethically correct. It is tactically intelligent because it raises the cost of the targeting behavior that every elite player faces. Coaches who stay quiet create vacuums, and opposing teams are professionals at filling vacuums. The trust deficit between Stephanie White and the portion of the Fever fan base that built itself around Caitlin Clark is real, documented in thousands of comment threads and social media posts and forum discussions, and it did not appear overnight. It accumulated over a season of moments where the response the fan base expected did not arrive in the form or the timing they needed to see it. Whether that deficit can be repaired is one of the central questions that will define the second half of this season and the franchise's relationship with the audience that made it commercially relevant. There is a promotional flyer. This detail has received less attention than it deserves in the broader conversation about this situation, possibly because it seems small in isolation. But nothing about this story should be evaluated in isolation because the pattern only becomes visible when you look at the whole picture. The Indiana Fever released promotional materials for a road trip stretch that featured, in the position typically associated with the franchise's marquee player, a different player. Not Sophie Cunningham, who has her own growing fan base and a visible vocal presence on the team. Not Kelsey Mitchell, who is a proven professional scorer with legitimate star quality. Not Aaliyah Boston, who is an excellent player with an impressive individual profile. A different player positioned in a marketing context that read to the fan base as a replacement rather than a complement. The franchise's explanation, to whatever extent one was offered, was logistical, marketing decision, availability, timing, the standard language that organizations use when a promotional choice generates more controversy than they anticipated. But here is what matters more than the explanation. What matters is what the image communicated to a fan base that had already spent months cataloging perceived signals about the franchise's actual commitment to the player they had built their emotional and financial investment around. In that context, the flyer did not land as a logistical decision. It landed as confirmation of a narrative that was already forming. A narrative about an organization that was quietly, gradually, possibly deliberately constructing an identity that could function without Caitlin Clark at its center. Is that narrative accurate? That question is genuinely complicated and deserves more information than is currently publicly available to answer definitively. What is not complicated is the impact. Tens of thousands of people received that image as a signal and responded to it as a signal. The comment sections were immediate and specific. People were not confused about what they thought they were seeing. They connected it directly to the coaching decisions, the officiating response failures, the injury opacity, and the broader pattern of organizational behavior that had been accumulating across the season. Combined with the ESPN segment that ran a warm, complimentary feature on a duo nickname for Kelsey Mitchell and Aaliyah Boston, while Clark was posting 20 points and 8 assists per game at historic statistical levels, the promotional flyer contributed to a coherent picture that the fan base assembled and acted upon. The picture was of an organization that was not all in. And fans who are all in themselves cannot sustain a relationship with an organization they perceive as hedging. The WNBA is not a young league. It has been operating for nearly 3 decades. It has navigated superstar careers, labor negotiations, franchise relocations, ownership changes, and the long, complicated arc of building a professional women's sports league in a commercial landscape that was not always welcoming to the project. It has also produced genuinely great players throughout its history. Players who deserved more attention, more resources, and more institutional support than they received. The league's historical limitations in those areas are documented, discussed, and widely acknowledged even within the organization itself. The Caitlin Clark moment was supposed to be different, not because Clark herself is necessarily greater than those players in any absolute basketball sense, but because the commercial moment that arrived with her was categorically different from anything the league had experienced before. The mainstream crossover had finally happened. The casual sports fan demographic, the television ratings category that moves advertising budgets and drives broadcast deals, had arrived. The moment the league had been building toward for 3 decades was actually here. The institutional response to that moment should have been swift, comprehensive, and oriented entirely around protecting and nurturing the asset that made it possible. Not because Clark deserved special treatment in any way that compromised the integrity of the competitive environment, but because any organization with a coherent understanding of its own commercial interests would have recognized that the sustainable development of this moment required keeping its central figure healthy, happy, and communicatively supported by the people around her. What actually happened was a slower, messier, more institutionally confused response that allowed problems to compound. The officiating culture around Clark was not addressed with the urgency the situation demanded. The coaching infrastructure around her was not constructed with the protective intentionality that her profile required. The communication culture around her health and status was not developed with the transparency that a fan base of her size and engagement level had earned. And now, the seats are empty and the financial projections are being revised and the league offices are reportedly in crisis mode, and the conversation happening at the highest levels of the sport is about damage control rather than momentum building. That is the cost of institutional failure, not paid by the executives who made the decisions, paid by the league, the fans, and the player who deserved better. Let us be precise about what happened when the Fever fans stayed home, because precision matters here and the instinct to either overdramatize or underappreciate what occurred is strong on both sides of the conversation. This was not a coordinated, formally organized boycott in the traditional sense. There was no organizing committee. There was no petition with a list of demands. There was no announced date of action or unified social media campaign with a hashtag and a press release. What happened was more organic and more powerful than any of those things. Independently, across thousands of individual decision-making processes, people who had bought into Caitlin Clark's presence in the WNBA concluded simultaneously that the product being offered without her was not worth their time or money. They communicated that conclusion through the most direct mechanism available. They kept their wallets in their pockets and their bodies out of the arena. And they talked about it loudly, specifically, and in ways that demonstrated a level of consumer sophistication that the league's executives need to take seriously as a long-term business reality rather than dismissing as fan drama or online noise. The message was not simply, "We only care about Caitlin Clark." The message was more nuanced and more instructive than that. It was, "We came to this league because of Caitlin Clark, we stayed because of what she represented about where this league was heading. We have been watching carefully, we have been cataloging the decisions being made by the people in charge, and we have concluded that those decisions do not reflect the same level of commitment to this project that we ourselves have made. And since we are the ones buying the tickets and the merchandise and the streaming subscriptions, we are the ones with the actual leverage." That is a sophisticated consumer position. It is also a warning, not a threat delivered with hostility, but a warning delivered through data that the organization cannot dispute or reframe. The empty seats produced a number. The streaming drops produced a number. The merchandise pause produced a number. Numbers do not have agendas. They simply reflect the consequences of decisions. The question now is whether the people making those decisions understand what they are being told. There is a conversation happening right now that extends far beyond the Indiana Fever's box office situation and the WNBA's immediate financial concerns. It is happening in locker rooms and agents' offices and training facilities wherever the next generation of women's basketball talent is developing and beginning to think seriously about their professional future. Those players are watching this situation. They are drawing conclusions. They are making assessments about what it looks like when an institution has a once-in-a-generation talent on its hands, and the question of how that talent is treated and protected gets answered in real time. Because the WNBA does not exist in isolation anymore, global professional leagues are growing. International opportunities that were previously limited are expanding. The commercial infrastructure that makes professional basketball financially viable for elite players is no longer exclusively concentrated in North America's established leagues. The next Caitlin Clark, the next player with genuine crossover cultural appeal and the audience generation capacity that comes with it, will have options that today's players are still navigating in earlier forms. And when that player is making her decision, she will look at this moment. She will look at what happened to the most successful, commercially impactful player in the league's recent history when her health became a question mark. She will look at how the coaching staff handled the targeting. She will look at how the front office communicated about the injury. She will look at how the league office responded to the financial signals the empty seats were sending. She will be drawing a conclusion about what kind of institutional environment the WNBA actually is for a player of her caliber. Not what the league says it is in its press releases and its marketing campaigns and its commissioners' public statements. What it demonstrably is based on documented behavior. That conclusion will influence decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars in aggregate economic impact. It will influence which players commit to building their professional identity inside this league and which players explore the expanding alternatives. The WNBA had a genuine opportunity to write a compelling answer to that question, to demonstrate that it had built an institutional culture sophisticated enough to protect and nurture and advocate for generational talent with the same intensity that it celebrates and markets that talent when everything is going well. The empty arenas suggest that the answer being written right now is not the one the league would choose if it had the chance to reconsider. There is a path forward. It is not easy, it is not fast, and it requires a level of genuine accountability from people who have historically operated in an environment with limited external pressure. But it exists, and it is worth describing clearly because the alternative, allowing this situation to continue deteriorating, produces outcomes that should be unacceptable to everyone with a stake in the league's future. The first requirement is radical transparency about Caitlin Clark's health, not a full medical file released to the public, not a violation of reasonable privacy norms, but something dramatically more honest than two vague words and a shrug. A real timeline, an honest severity assessment, a visible, documented commitment to not rushing the recovery process in ways that risk long-term damage to a career that extends far beyond any single season. Fans who have invested emotionally and financially in this player's professional journey have earned something more than institutional opacity. They have earned a relationship with the organization that reflects the relationship they have demonstrated toward it through their purchasing behavior and their attendance and their viewership. The second requirement is genuine coaching accountability that goes beyond delayed statements and reactive advocacy. Stephanie White needs to be visibly, loudly, and proactively protective of her star player going forward in ways that create new expectations rather than simply managing the aftermath of old ones. The officiating conversation needs to be ongoing, specific, and on record rather than occasional, vague, and timed to news cycles. The culture inside the program needs to demonstrably shift toward one where every person associated with the organization understands that protecting Caitlin Clark is not just morally correct, but is the organizational priority that everything else is built around. The third requirement is organizational clarity about identity. The Indiana Fever built their commercial relevance on Caitlin Clark's arrival. That is not an opinion. It is documented in the ticket sale trajectories, the merchandise numbers, the national broadcast interest, and the road game attendance figures. An organization that built its commercial identity on a particular foundation, and then appears to be quietly constructing an alternative foundation, is not just making a basketball decision. It is sending a message to its fan base about the relationship between what it sells and what it actually values. That message needs to be corrected, not through statements but through the consistent pattern of daily decisions that either confirm or contradict what was communicated when Clark arrived. The fourth requirement is a league-level reckoning with the officiating culture that has allowed the targeting pattern around Clark to persist. This is not about individual referees or individual game calls. It is about whether the institutional framework that governs how games are officiated is functioning in a way that protects the league's most commercially important player with the same standards applied to comparable players elsewhere in professional sports. If that framework is not functioning correctly, fixing it is not optional. It is the minimum required response to a situation that has already produced demonstrable physical consequences. None of these requirements is beyond the capacity of the organizations involved. All of them require the kind of genuine institutional commitment to accountability that is harder than it sounds for organizations that have operated with limited external pressure. The empty arenas change the pressure calculation. The question now is whether that changed calculation produces changed behavior. The seats are empty. That is not a metaphor. That is a photograph, documented, shared, and impossible to unspin. What it represents is the most honest verdict that a fan base can deliver, not anger performed for social media, not hollow threats that evaporate with the news cycle. A real financially measurable, commercially undeniable signal that tens of thousands of people sent simultaneously when they concluded that the organization entrusted with the greatest gift women's professional basketball has ever received was not treating that gift with the care it deserved. Caitlin Clark is going to return. The only question that matters is what she returns to. An organization that used her absence to quietly solidify an alternative identity, one where she is a featured player rather than the irreplaceable center of everything? Or an organization that spent every day she was out building stronger infrastructure, louder advocacy, more transparent communication, and a clearer commitment to the vision that filled those arenas in the first place? The fans will know the difference the moment they see it. They always do. This is not just a story about one injury, one boycott, or one bad stretch of ticket sales. This is the story of a league at a crossroads, holding something rare and fragile and extraordinary, and being forced to answer in public with the lights on and the cameras rolling, whether it truly understands what it has. The empty seats are not the end, they are the warning before the end, and there is still time to listen. But not much. Subscribe for the next breakdown. This story is not finished, and neither are we.